At 7 a.m., a man could be seen running, having just completed a 10 kilometers run. From then until noon, he practiced kendo, delivering 500 head strikes to a dummy. By 5 p.m., he headed to the gym for body training under the guidance of an instructor. His workout for the day consisted of 3 major exercises: bench press, squat, and deadlift, each performed for 10 sets of 10 repetitions. Committed to repeating this routine for 14 consecutive days, the man had already submitted his resignation letter to his workplace, deciding to leave his job to fully focus on his regimen. The man recalled someone once asking if he had suddenly gone crazy for resigning from his job just to train his body. Upon hearing this, he wondered that perhaps being crazy might have been the better option. As he pondered this, a system screen unexpectedly appeared before him. The system informed him that the door to the end of days was about to open, and that only 5 seconds remained until the apocalypse. It warned him to prepare for the impending catastrophe, providing him with quests to strengthen himself in order to face the coming disaster. As time ticked down, the timer hit 0, and the end of days finally descended upon the world. 15 days ago, everyone received an urgent message on their phones, warning of a critical disaster. Monsters had appeared near Inwang Mountain. Citizens in the surrounding area were instructed to evacuate immediately to avoid encountering the creatures. Confusion spread as people read the message, with many assuming it was a prank. Just then, a live video from a reporter appeared, confirming to everyone that the monsters were real and the situation was no joke. The reporter, addressing everyone watching his live video, said that since he had come all the way to the scene, he should get a little closer to the monster for a better look. However, at that moment, viewers began spamming the chat, warning him that the monster was right behind him. The reporter dismissed the warnings, believing they were joking, since he had just checked and the monster hadn't moved. But in the next instant, the monster suddenly appeared behind him and killed him on the spot. The reporter's scream startled a man named Lee Ho-young, who was watching the broadcast. As Lee Ho-young walked, he couldn't help but be surprised by how realistic the video looked. Throughout the day, everyone had been receiving disaster alert messages, and he wondered what was really going on. He thought to himself that life was already hard enough without the sudden talk of monsters. Lee wasn't about to believe something so far-fetched. With so many fake videos circulating lately, he was convinced this was just another hoax. But as he looked ahead, he was shocked to see a monster lying on the ground right in front of him. Lee wondered why there was an injured monster lying on the ground in front of him. It was unsettling, and fear crept over him, so he decided to run. Trying to ignore the wounded creature, Lee loudly made an excuse, saying, "I need to get home early, today's the day my math teacher is coming." As he turned to leave, the monster tried to stop him, looking at him with an innocent expression and asking for help. Lee hesitated, realizing the monster was indeed asking for his assistance, but despite its attempt to appear cute, the creature was still far too terrifying for Lee to handle. Lee thought to himself that he was human, while the creature before him was a monster. He wasn't the type of person kind enough to show compassion to a monster, even if it looked at him with innocent eyes. He reasoned that he couldn't help it, no matter how pitiful it seemed. But just then, the monster pulled out a picture of its family, sobbing and gesturing that it wanted to return to them. Seeing this, Lee's resolve faltered, and he couldn't hold back any longer. Despite his earlier reluctance, he decided to help the monster. Later, after assisting the creature, Lee returned home. At that moment, the system notified him that he had received a silver goblin's pill. The system hinted that consuming the pill would grant him something secret and valuable. Lee couldn't believe what had just happened. He had helped a monster and, on top of that, received a gift from it. It didn't seem like something a monster would do, and it left him questioning whether it was truly a monster at all. Curious about the gift, the mysterious pill, Lee also began to wonder about the strange system that kept appearing in front of him. Thinking it might be a hologram, he reached out to touch it. As his thoughts drifted to the pill, he wondered what would happen if he consumed it. Just then, an urgent news broadcast appeared on TV. The reporter announced that large, mysterious buildings had suddenly appeared all over the world. The reporter described them as towers and mentioned that they had lost contact with the U.S. Army, which had entered one of the structures. Upon hearing the news, Lee was stunned by the appearance of both monsters and unknown towers. He wondered if the apocalypse had truly begun. As he held the pill in his hand, an explosion suddenly shook the area outside his house. People were screaming, fleeing in panic from the source of the commotion. Then, everyone stopped in their tracks, frozen in shock as a massive tower emerged out of nowhere. At that moment, the news reporter announced that a huge tower had also appeared in Korea. Lee, seeing the tower so close to his home, clenched his fist. Without hesitation, he decided to consume the pill given to him by the monster. Lee wasn't sure if the decision he was about to make was the right one, but this was his only chance to do something as crazy as consuming a pill from a monster. In that moment of uncertainty, he swallowed the pill. Instantly, a massive surge of power coursed through his body. The system appeared again, informing him that he had unlocked the Sage status window, which would give him the highest chance of survival in the current situation. Just then, particles resembling pieces of a puzzle began to gather and form a glowing, radiant book. Lee, still in shock, reached out his hand. To his surprise, he found himself holding the luminous book. As soon as Lee opened the book, a brilliant light erupted from its pages. The system reappeared, informing him that the door to the end of days was about to open, with only 15 days, 4 hours, and 12 minutes remaining. It urged Lee to prepare for the impending catastrophe and recommended that he begin training his body. At that moment, the system presented Lee with a quest that included strength training, cardio exercises, and learning kendo, tasks he needed to complete in the time leading up to the end of days. At that moment, Lee decided to heed the system's instructions. Time passed, and he committed himself to the guide's recommendations. He gave up everything else and devoted the next 15 days solely to training. As the countdown ended, the door of the end opened. Upon seeing the system notification, Lee was surprised. It was quite different from what he had imagined. Suddenly, a blunt sword materialized in front of him, leaving him astonished. The system then announced that the game had officially begun and that it was now time for the tutorial. It also informed Lee that the aptitude test had been completed, and based on its data analysis, he would be assigned the most suitable class for his abilities. The system then announced that Lee had been assigned the class of combat swordsmanship. He was taken aback to receive such a class. Following this, the system instructed him to open his status window for more details. However, when Lee opened it, he was overwhelmed by the sheer volume of information that popped up. There was too much to read at once. As he scanned the status window, he noticed that he was a level 1 swordsman and had a level 1 skill in basic swordsmanship. The status window also displayed his stats: stamina, strength, agility, and sensitivity, all at low levels since he was just starting out at level 1. Lee stood up, picked up his sword, and felt a surge of excitement at being designated a combat swordsman. He realized that this was the moment when everything would truly begin. At that moment, the system displayed a list of objectives he needed to complete. He had to choose at least one of the two options presented. The first was to survive in the forest he was currently in for 60 minutes, and the second was to find the exit and escape. Lee thought to himself that if this was meant to be a tutorial, it should provide him with time to adjust to the game before things really started. Lee then opened the guidebook in his system, which informed him that he needed to use the full 60 minutes of the tutorial to defeat as many monsters as possible. The guidebook also noted that choosing the second option, finding the exit, would hinder his growth and was therefore not recommended. Lee was surprised to discover that he could access the Sage status window during the tutorial as well. At that moment, he realized that the Sage status window had prompted him to exercise because it anticipated that situations like this would arise. Based on the guide's advice, Lee realized he had to hunt the monsters in the vicinity, so he decided it would be best not to run away from the forest. Just then, the system announced that the tutorial had officially begun, and at that moment, a small monster appeared in front of him. Lee was taken aback. The creature was a level 1 one-horned raccoon and surprisingly cuter than he had expected a monster to be. However, in an instant, the raccoon transformed, displaying a vicious expression as it lunged at Lee. Reacting swiftly, Lee slashed the monster effortlessly, dispatching it without any difficulty. At that moment, the system announced that Lee had successfully killed the one-horned raccoon and gained experience for his effort. Since the monster had fallen to a single strike from his basic swordsmanship, Lee concluded that it was very weak, just a typical tutorial monster. He noticed that using his basic swordsmanship had consumed 2 magic power points. With only 10 magic power available, this meant he could only use the technique 5 more times. Realizing this, Lee understood that he needed to conserve as much magic power as possible while hunting for monsters. As Lee continued to defeat numerous monsters, he finally leveled up to level 2. Not only that, but he also regained his health and magic power with the level increase. The system then informed him that he would earn points each time he leveled up, which he could use to enhance his stats. Excited by this revelation, Lee felt grateful for the level up, especially since his magic power was nearly depleted. However, just as he was reveling in his progress, Lee noticed something strange: the system was beginning to fade away. In that moment, the system explained that because he possessed the Sage's status window, he would level up more slowly compared to other players. Lee was left feeling both puzzled and intrigued by this new information. Lee was taken aback by this revelation, realizing that there was a penalty associated with having the Sage's status window. He couldn't believe that the level he had just gained came at such a cost, and he began to wonder when he would be able to level up again. Frustrated by what he perceived as an absurd handicap, Lee decided to call upon his status window to display his stats. However, upon examining the information presented, he was puzzled by what he saw. Something felt off, and he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something wrong with his stats. Upon examining his stats, Lee was surprised to find that he still had points available. At that moment, he thought to himself that if his assumptions were correct, this wasn't a penalty at all. Rather, it was an overpowered, bug-like ability. Although he had fallen back to level 1 as expected, his remaining points continued to increase. Lee realized that the more he leveled up, the more experience he would need for the next level. He concluded that raising his stats this way would be easier than leveling up through normal means. Determined, he decided to focus on enhancing his stats. As he looked at the options available to him, he saw that he had 4 choices to make. Lee considered that boosting his strength and agility would be the best choices for a combat swordsman. Strength would enable stronger attacks, while agility would enhance his speed and reflexes. However, he realized that the stat he needed most at that moment was sensitivity, so he decided to allocate points to increase that stat. As he continued to defeat the one-horned raccoons, Lee reflected that the monsters in the vicinity were relatively weak, merely tutorial monsters. He was able to defeat them easily with his default stats. The challenge, however, was that finding enough one-horned raccoons within the given time limit would be difficult, limiting his opportunities to further increase his stats. This was why Lee had chosen to level up his sensitivity stat, and as a result, it had become much easier for him to locate the raccoons now that his sensitivity was heightened. Just as he was contemplating his situation, a system notification popped up, informing him that he had defeated all the monsters in the area, which activated a hidden quest. At that moment, a massive level 2 monster, identified as the one-horned raccoon Alpha, appeared behind him, glaring at Lee with vicious anger. Lee, taken aback, wondered what kind of formidable creature stood before him. At that moment, the one-horned raccoon Alpha launched itself at Lee with a powerful attack, but he barely managed to dodge it. Lee noted the monster's impressive speed and began to wonder if it was the boss of the tutorial. He took a moment to calm himself and assess the situation. Upon closer inspection, Lee realized that this monster was distinctly different from the other one-horned raccoons he had fought and defeated. While he acknowledged that the Alpha was indeed more powerful than its predecessors, he also understood that defeating it was still within his reach. Determined, Lee prepared to confront the formidable creature before him. After a few moments, the system notified Lee that he had successfully defeated the one-horned raccoon Alpha. Not only had he completed the hidden quest, but he had also received gold as a reward. The system then confirmed that Lee had officially finished the tutorial. Reflecting on the experience, Lee thought to himself how unexpectedly long the 1-hour tutorial had felt, though he was relieved that it was finally over. However, as he opened his eyes, Lee was stunned to find himself in an entirely different place. To his shock, he was now standing among a group of other people, unsure of where he was or what would happen next. At that moment, a booming announcement congratulated everyone present for successfully completing the tutorial. The announcement went on to explain that they were now in the lobby of the tower, located in the C-2567 region. Lee felt confused by the mention of a lobby and wondered what it could mean. As he took in his surroundings, he noticed 14 men and 11 women nearby. Curiosity sparked within him. He began to wonder if they had also completed the same tutorial and had been transported here just like him. Lee observed the situation and noticed that most of the people around him were in a state of panic. He thought it was understandable. After all, the entire world had changed in just a day. Reflecting on the chaos, he realized that if he hadn't known beforehand about the impending apocalypse, he too would likely be caught up in the fear. Determined to stay composed, Lee reminded himself that he needed to focus on surviving this ordeal. Just then, a woman spoke up, asking where they were. Before anyone could respond, a small figure approached and explained that they were in the tower known as the Tower of the End. As the woman looked down, she was taken aback to see a talking rabbit answering her question. The rabbit introduced itself, stating that its name was Kumkum and that it was the manager of the lower floor of the tower. Everyone gasped in disbelief, bombarding it with questions about how it had appeared out of nowhere. Some wondered if it was a child in a rabbit suit, while others asked if it was responsible for bringing everyone to the tower. Kumkum sighed, thinking to itself that such reactions were entirely normal for newcomers. Amid the commotion, Lee stepped forward and addressed Kumkum directly, expressing his desire to know one thing. If this was truly the end of the world, what were all the people supposed to do now? Kumkum, hearing Lee's question, nodded and replied that it was indeed an excellent inquiry. Kumkum then smiled menacingly and informed everyone present that all 22 players in the lobby of the tower would be participating in a life-or-death game. The gravity of Kumkum's words sent shockwaves through the crowd, leaving everyone stunned at the realization that their lives were at stake. Kumkum continued, explaining that all humans on Earth were currently within the tower and that they would need to work together for each mission and floor they aimed to climb. Hearing this, Lee raised his hand and asked Kumkum if they would be able to return to their normal lives once they reached the top of the tower. Kumkum, with a playful grin, replied that it, too, had no idea what would happen when they finally made it to the top. Upon hearing Kumkum's response, Lee asked what the purpose of climbing the tower was. Kumkum replied that there was no need to search for meaning in such matters, Lee simply had to do what he was told. The rabbit ominously added that only death awaited those who refused to climb the tower, mentioning that a significant number of people had already perished during the tutorials. At that moment, panic washed over Lee as he realized the grim reality of the situation. He had not considered that people could actually die, and even though it was just a tutorial, he knew there were many who might have struggled to complete it. At that moment, Kumkum spoke up, asking if anyone was willing to try and kill him, explaining that his death was necessary for them to return home. He added that those who assisted him would receive a special reward. The announcement left everyone shocked and confused, while Lee couldn't shake the feeling that it might be a trap. Kumkum didn't seem very strong, but Lee quickly realized that there was no way he could defeat a creature that was level 55. Deciding it was best to stay back and observe for now, Lee hesitated. Just then, the system notification popped up, instructing him that he needed to help Kumkum, the lower floor manager, get home. Lee contemplated how he would assist Kumkum in reaching home and whether it was acceptable to attack him. Although he had always found it beneficial to heed the guide's advice, Lee wondered if it was worth engaging in something so suspicious. Confusion washed over him as he struggled to decide on a course of action. Just then, one of the other participants stepped forward, declaring his willingness to help Kumkum reach home. With a smile, the man told Kumkum that if it wanted to die so badly, he would gladly oblige. Lee realized he was too late to offer his assistance, watching as the man brandished his sword, warning Kumkum not to regret it, promising to deliver a painful death. Just as the man was about to swing his sword at Kumkum, the rabbit's expression shifted dramatically. In an instant, Kumkum delivered a powerful blow to the man's head, severing it from his body and sending it flying backward. The gruesome scene left everyone in shock, paralyzed by fear. Kumkum, now wearing a sinister grin, remarked that it had been an accidental counterattack. The other participants screamed in terror, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Lee stood frozen, too frightened to move, realizing that he could have met the same fate had he offered to help Kumkum with his request. Kumkum, trying to regain control of the situation, insisted that the earlier incident had been a mistake and asked for another volunteer. However, no one believed him. Panic-stricken, they scattered away from the rabbit in fear. Lee found himself questioning whether the guide had deceived him. Kumkum extended his hand once more, pleading for someone to help him return home, but the gruesome display had left everyone unwilling to step forward. In that moment of uncertainty, Lee wondered why the guide would mislead him. He decided to consult the guidebook again and discovered another ability he possessed: the Sage's Eyes, in addition to the Sage's status window. This ability would allow him to trigger the Sage status window and view the status of other players, providing valuable insight into their abilities and intentions. Lee wondered why another ability had appeared alongside the Sage's status window and where it had come from. Curious, he activated his Sage's Eyes on Kumkum. A smile crept across his face as he realized how to assist Kumkum with its request. As Kumkum continued to plead for help, Lee stepped forward, declaring his willingness to aid the creature. In that moment, he felt reassured that the guide hadn't misled him after all. Kumkum looked at him, noting his low level, and remarked on it. But Lee quickly interrupted, insisting that level didn't matter when he was about to perform a good deed. Kumkum, grinning menacingly, acknowledged Lee's words, agreeing that he was indeed correct. Kumkum urged Lee to send him home quickly. Just as Lee was about to draw his sword, a woman interrupted him, cautioning that it was too dangerous, especially after witnessing someone die moments earlier while trying to fulfill Kumkum's request. The others chimed in, agreeing with her and urging Lee not to act recklessly. However, Lee interrupted them, assuring them it was fine because he had a plan for the situation. He promised that they were about to witness something exciting. Confusion spread among the crowd as they wondered what kind of plan Lee had in mind. At that moment, Kumkum charged at Lee, but Lee remained calm and unafraid. As he stood his ground, he realized something strange about Kumkum's earlier statement. Lee was certain there had been 25 people in the lobby, yet Kumkum announced that only 24 players would participate in the game with their lives on the line. Initially, Lee considered the possibility of a mistake, but then he dismissed that idea. It became clear to him that this was a test, a way for the others to confront their fear of facing a level 55 monster and the very real threat of death. Kumkum's mention of the wrong number was intentional. There had only been 24 players in the lobby to begin with, and the person who had just died was merely a hologram. At that moment, everyone was shocked when Kumkum delivered a powerful blow to Lee. However, Lee remained unfazed. He realized that not only was the man who had just died a hologram, but Kumkum was also merely a hologram, which meant it had no actual attack power. This revelation came to Lee when he used his Sage's Eye skill to examine Kumkum's stats, confirming that it posed no real threat. Kumkum, realizing that Lee had figured everything out, acknowledged him with a nod of respect. "You're quite perceptive," he said. "For those like you, who possess courage, may the odds be ever in your favor." With that, Kumkum vanished into thin air, leaving the players in a state of awe.